Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today, we will discuss a module on Canadian Anglophone and Francophone plays. And this module is prepared by Rindon Kundu, Research Fellow, Senior Research Fellow, Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University. In this module, we will discuss about the English Canadian drama in post-contact period, 19th century Anglophone Canadian drama, Anglophone Canadian theatre after the World War I, Anglophone Canadian theatre after the World War II, and French Canadian drama before 1837, French Canadian plays from 1837 to 1900, French Canadian drama from 1900 to 1948, French Canadian drama from 1948 to 1968, French Canadian theatre from 1968 to present. This module starts with defining the term like English Canadian and French Canadian, and what is English Canadian about English Canadian literature, as well as French Canadian about French Canadian literature. Jonathan Weiss and Jane Moss, in their book French Canadian Literature 1996, have noted that the term French Canadian most appropriately refers to the literature of Quebec, as well as refers to the literature of French Canada, that is entire Quebec and other French-speaking parts of Canada before the 1960s. At this time, there was a strong nationalist sentiment running throughout Quebec, and the adjectival French term Québécois has replaced the term French Canadian. The English Canadian writer and the French Canadian writer have different experiences in Canada, and the second one's experience is longer than the first. If we go by the language of the literary text, then should we bracket them as a part of English literature or French literature? We will address such questions throughout this module. Now, the scholar like Northrop Frye, doubtless one of Canada's most celebrated intellectuals and experts, write of this relationship between region and culture. I quote, "Culture has something vegetable about it, something that increasingly needs to grow from roots, something that demands a small region and a restricted locale." Unquote. Canadian culture is not so much a single or composite entity as it is a series of regional responses, each born of the myriad circumstances of a place, as these are imagined by the writer. Frye continues, "What was an inarticulate space on the map is now responding to the world with the tongues and eyes of a matured and disciplined imagination." I will begin this module with a quotation that problematizes the French-Canadian identity. Jean Vautilet, in his seminal book titled Les Canadiens Franques et son double, The French Canadian and His Double, published in 1972, wrote, "The Canadian identity is a mirror which reflects the image of the other when we look at ourselves in it." In other words, the French Canadians went to present themselves directly rather than representing through the mirror of homogeneous Canadian identity. For this, the French speakers, especially those are involved in literature and cultural fields, redefined themselves as Québécois, and around 1970s, this adjectival term becomes a vehicle of nationalist identity. The vast literature that is coming out of Quebec shows that there are things common reality, common themes, and above all, a common language. French, which can give the Quebec literature its own identity, in spite of having differences in writing the term Quebec literature, demands its separate entity vis-a-vis English Canadian literature. Quebec literature at the present time has been given diverse names like Francophone literature of Canada or North American literature written in French. So in this part, we tried to discuss about the context of English Canadian and the French Canadian, and what does mean with the phrase French Canadian, and what does mean with the phrase English Canadian, and relation between English and Canadian and relation between French and Canadian. And such context is very important to get involved further with the subject. English Canadian drama in post-contact period. The earliest performances in post-contact period took place in the 16th and 17th century. Maurice dancing and May games to delight the savage people, performed in 1583 by the crew of Sir Henry Givert's ship in St. John's Harbour, is the first recorded performances on Canadian soil. But these performances have hidden agendas of colonization, as the Europeans wanted to cater the taste of the native Canadians by whatever means possible. Around the 18th century, military officials, armies, and local bourgeois class together adapted English dramas and performed in front of the native to make them understand how empty are the natives in terms of creative space and how rich the Europeans are. There was a small amount of early Canadian drama in English, and that too shaped largely by Britishers. For example, Lieutenant Adam Allen's The New Gentle Shepherd, 1798, which was based on Alan Ramsay's The Gentle Shepherd, 1725, a pastoral drama in Scottish dialect. English heroic tragedies, George Cooking's verse drama The Conquest of Canada, 1766, was based on John Dryden's The Conquest of Granada, 1671. 19th century Anglophone Canadian drama. 19th century Anglophone Canadian drama was dominated by the dominant dramatic genre closest poetic drama. Thomas Hill's lost play, The Provincial Association, which was so satirical that it caused tension in the nearby locality, and Dolor Solatio by Sam Scribble, 1865, a good humored local political parody. Other such works were satire blends with closed drama are Henry Fuller's Gilbert and Sullivan, HMS Parliament, 1880. John E.P. Aldous and John Mackworth's Tatermagon, 1895. Shakespearean drama and romantic drama of the Western Europe have been modeled to Canadian writers such as Charles Mayer, William Wilfred Campbell, and Charles Hevises, who wrote new Shakespearean or new romantic verse dramas. Such examples are Campbell's Mordred, 1895, Hevisege's Saul, 1857, and Mayer's Tecumseh, 1866. Women are also dominant on stage at this time, and they represent different contemporary everyday issues in their dramas, ranging from construction of gender, role of women in the society, relevance of working women in family, independence from patriarchy, etc. Few such examples are Sarah Ann Curgen's The Sweet Girl Graduate, 1882, and Laura Secker, the heroine of 1812 in 1887, and Eliza Lansford's Cushing, Esther, 1838, and The Fatal Ring, 1840. In this part of our discussion, we have discussed about the very beginning of the theatre, beginning of the drama or play written in this French Canadian culture, and we rooted back to the 18th century to get the historical evidences and to get to know about the historical growth of the drama in this context. Now let us talk about Anglophone Canadian theatre after World War I. 20th century Anglophone Canadian drama followed the European avant-garde theatre and constructed theatre hall after Dublin's Abbey Theatre. It was fashioned after the European lifestyle Little Theatre movement that had traits of both nationalism and naturalism. Toronto's Hut House became the Little Theatre under Roy Mitchell. Canadian plays from Hut House Theatre in 1926 to 7 was published by Vincent Massey from it. Local theatre groups performed Merrill Denison's Brothers in Arms 1921 and March Hare 1923. Both are naturalistic in nature. Louis Reynolds sketched social satires among those present 1933 and Neil McNabb's 1934 were houseful hits. Though poetic dramas such as the Reverend Robert Norwood's The Witch of Endor 1916 continued to be written in the 20th century was predominant in nature. Melodramas and light comedies such as W.A. Treman's The Man Who Went 1918, a wartime spy thriller, were also performed. Marjorie Pickles' The Woodcarver's Wife 1920 is a significant play of the period which, albeit a romantic melodrama, reflects modernist and proto-feminist overtones. It talks about the role of women and native people within imperialist project. An important contribution was made by Herman Worden with his symphonic expression, his symphony, a drama of motion and light for a new theatre, is a play without any dialogue. In a Cambridge Companion to Canadian Literature, Rick Nowell notes, Worden's work represents the totalizing formalist containment of disciplinary difference within an overriding master vision rather than any more open or interdiscursive hybridity. While the bourgeois amateur theatre was in full swing with the Dominion Drama Festival being organized annually, a left-wing workers' theatre was also performed simultaneously with a radical political ideology that found its strategy in the international workers' movement. These plays were modern and mostly documentary. Its best-known play was Eight Men Speak by Oscar Ryan, E. Cecil Smith, Frank Love, and Mildred Goldberg. The workers' theatre was arguably the most innovative of the period, introducing the techniques of Bertolt Brecht, Erwin Piscator, and American documentary drama to a Canadian tradition that would later boast the documentaries of Toronto Workshop Productions. Theatre Passe Muraille and the Marmor Troops. It is in this backdrop that most of the political plays of the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s are best read, including work emerging out of the Canadian Popular Theatre Alliance and the work of such playwrights as Arthur Miller, 0 Hour 1986, Masada 1989, and David Fenario on the Job 1975, Balconville 1979, and Joe Beef 1991, Banana Boats 1994. So in this part we try to briefly talk about the Anglophone Canadian play and its expansion through theatre and the emergence of left workers party's movement and that influences of that political movement in the Anglophone Canadian theatre. Now let us talk about Anglophone Canadian theatre after World War II. The most significant development in the 1950s post Second World War was the founding of Toronto Workshop Productions in 1959 by George Luscombe following Joan Littlewood's theatre workshop in Stanford East, London. One of the reasons that this period is significant in terms of dramatic evolution is that the dramatists have followed the politically engaged dramaturgy of Piscator and Brecht. The tradition of collective documentary and the search for hybrid Canadian dramaturgies is another notable characteristics of this time. In collaborations such as Hey Rube 1961, Mr. Bones 1969, Chicago 70 1970, 10 Lost Years 1974, and Ain't Looking 1980. Luscombe created a hybrid documentary form that blended elements from circus and minstrelsy with mime, music, and team sports to address issues of class, revolutionary politics, and race. The other development of this period is the one-act plays in a variety of styles became a predominant form of the time. Poet Marjoria picked Hall's evocative verse drama, The Woodcarver's Wife or University Magazine in 1920 was performed and appreciated at Hart House, University of Toronto. The Great American Depression of 30s also led to numerous workers' plays. Dorothy Livesey, whose Joe Dairy, Masses 1933, is a narrated pantomime, was the most famous author involved. Eight Men Speak, 1934, by Oscar Ryan, E. Cecil Smith, H. Francis, and Mildred Goldberg was the most notable plays. So, in the post-World War II situation, the remarkable addition in the history of Anglophone Canadian theatre drama is the introduction of one-act play, which was very popular and which carries the voices of the time through its theme and narrative. Now, let us talk about French Canadian drama of 1900 to 1948. Critics have compartmentalized pre-1837 period as pre-literary. 19th century is an affirmation of literary identity. 20th century is the maturity period of Francophone Canadian literature. As 19th century French Canadian literature has been seen as reactionary for its overdependence on idealism and romanticism, 20th century French Canadian literature is utterly cosmopolitan as Quebec was becoming rapidly urbanized. At this outset, a group of poets formed Les Écoles Littéraires de Montréal or the Montreal Literary School to meet and read their verse. Very little happened in French Canadian drama till the middle of the 1930s. The tour of the French actress in Quebec has ignited the zeal of doing theatre, and in a short notice, 3 professional theatre halls, Stellar Theatre, Theatre National, and the Theatre des Nouveautés. Émile Logault, founder of the troupe called Les Compagnons de Saint-Laurent, studied the dramatic techniques in France. Then he came back trained a group of actors at Quebec. With them, he presented a selection of classical European plays around 1950s. So, Legault's contribution to the growth of theatre in Quebec was an important one since he opened up the stage for serious theatre. Sometimes intimate theatre in the context of production techniques that were characterized by simplicity, sobriety, and aesthetic innovation, as well as he has tried to build up a kind of theatre culture in the region. End of 1930s, Quebec theatre has become much more influenced by the close neighbor, United States of America. Gratien Gallinas, the most successful dramatist of this time, produced Titcoq 1949, which bring back the working class of Quebec to the theatre stage. They have identified themselves with the characters of the play as it is quintessential Quebec and realistic in nature. Marcel Dubé, another dramatist who worked on the people of lower economic strata and write a play titled Zone 1953, an adaptation of Gabriel Roy's novel. Thus, these two playwrights opened up a new territory for the theatre in Quebec. Now, let us talk about the theatre from 1948 to 1968 and the French Canadian drama of these 2 decades, the development of drama in these 2 decades. The reason behind such periodization of French Canadian literature at the year 1948 is the publication of a manifesto of global refusal issued by a group of 16 writers and artists which declares the artist's declaration of complete independence. So this brief period of 20 odd years has seen a quantum leap not only in terms of social, political and economical change, but a radical change in creative writing and imagination on which newer landscapes will be drawn in the next decade. The dramatic text of this period are chiefly psychological dramas. The plays of Dube and Galinas, besides being working class dramas, are also psychological in nature. There are some other good productions by Anne Havertz and Yves Ferriers in the realm of psychological theatre, such as Anne Havertz's Les Tempes Sauvages, The Wild Time, 1966. Yves Ferriers' La Marquise, The Worker, 1950. The themes these theatres signaled: the family no longer a refuge but a torture chamber, the center of bitter conflicts, generation gap, anger of the younger generation, etc. Conditions are slowly becoming ripe for the growth of a national dramaturgy as rich as varied as a novel in Quebec. The Canada Council increased its aid to the theatre almost thrice between 1964 and 1965. During the 1950s and 1960s, a number of new professional theatres were established in Montreal, and there was a significant growth in the number of semi-professional or experimental theatres. In 1962, the Quebec government took control of the Conservatoire des Arts Dramatiques, making it into Quebec's primary acting school. Perhaps most important was the foundation in 1965 of the Centre d'Essai des Auteurs Dramaticus. This group of playwrights, which continues to exist in the 1990s, gives dramatic readings that generally promotes a sense of a collective, non-commercial effort at creating a kind of drama that is specifically Quebecose. This period from 1948 to 68, we have explained that the reason behind this periodization, that the famous manifesto of that 16 authors, that global refusal which claimed for the complete independence and influence of it in novel and theatre of that time, and the emergence of different undercurrents and different new webs in literature, both in novel and plays, we can observe. So we have discussed that perspective in the context of plays. Now let us talk about the French Canadian literature from 1968 to present time. The next 2 decades have seen a topsy-turvy political situation. The quest for identity is a recurrent theme in terms of Quebec literature, which was championed in. So these themes show that the present Quebec literature is not engulfed into the boundary of nationalism, rather exploring newer issues. When the first play by Michael Tremblay was brought to the stage in 1968, there was already backstage, so to speak, a considerable amount of experimental theatrical activity. His first play, Les Belles Soirées, marked the beginning of the new Quebec theatre, a theatre that differed in form, content, and language from what had come before, a groundbreaking start for a post-1968 Quebec drama. Jean Barbier also followed Tremblay in terms of working class setting from his first play, Ben-Hur. Michael Gurnier, another contemporary playwright who tries to achieve a level of lyricism by the use of music, songs, and a poetic form in his plays like Strauss et Peasant, Antoine Merland, a prominent women playwright, achieved success with La Sagoune and Evangelia Deuces, Evangelia II, 1975. Jacques Claude Germain's theatre is full of Quebec history and legends. His play, titled one of the longest titles in Quebec theatre, it is an untranslatable play on words ending with a slogan of the office de la langue francaise, To speak well is to respect yourself. Where dramatization of the complexity of the Quebecois personality in a country whose values and culture are imposed from the outside. He explores Quebec's past in history and in legend, which is the subject of Un pays dont la devise de molde, a country whose motto is I forget myself in 1976. Next in discussion are Francois Loringer and Robert Guéric, who wrote political theatre in the 1960s and 1970s. Franco's longest play, Le Chemin du Roi, The King's Road, and The Medium Rare, and Robert Guéric's Hamlet, Prince de Quebec, 1968, and The Trial of Jean Baptiste M, 1972, are written in response to specific political events. Marie Laverge's It Was Before the War in Gilles Cove was produced in 1981. It is a strong feminist answer to the patriarchal society of Quebec. Another important theatre of early 80s is Jean-Pierre Ronfort, The Life and Death of the Lame King, 1981, which is a kind of historical fresco that takes its audience on a voyage that spans centuries, continents, and cultures. René Daniel Dubois, a playwright and actor, introduced absurdism in Quebec drama. And Penny Longueuil, 1988, and Being at Home with Claude in 1984 dramatized avant-garde techniques, absurdity of life, and quest for meaning. One recent innovation in Western Francophone theatre is the use of narrativized dramatic monologues. Now, in this discussion, we have come across the present or contemporary development, or development since 1968, development of play since 1968, and the present undercurrents or present webs in the theatre performance and the writing of play we have discussed in this part. Now, let us summarize the model. In conclusion, it could be argued that Canadian theatre is a vibrant, diverse, innovative, experimental, creative literary corpus. We have dealt with the political, social, and economical changes of Canada and informed the readers about the transformation of Canadian theatre. The recurrent feature of English Canadian drama is hybridity, as the language and dramaturgical structure have been taken from Europe, the abode of the colonial masters, but the plot or content has been taken from native Canada and amalgamated and appropriated in Canada, as it happened in case of most of the indigenous literatures and most of the genres in indigenous literature in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, that mainly forms are borrowed or translated from Europe, but the content of the text, the essence of the text is very much indigenous. And throughout this module, we have briefly discussed the emergence of different kind of plays and the changes in the theatrical performances and addressing these theatrical practices. I mean, how these theatrical practices address the global issue, the international issue, the issues of the local politics, society, and culture, and how these theatrical performances carries the infusion of English and Canada, infusion of French and Canada, and how these theatrical practices carries the essence and identity of life, culture, tradition of the indigenous people. For self-assessment, you can consult the self-assessment file. Thank you.